there's kind of 1 minute delay between what we say and what's broadcasted. So
Exactly. But maybe we are now live or not. As always, there is a little bit of drilling to understand if everything is working and if somebody is watching us. Be patient. I think that now we are, at least on my screen, yes, we are live. Okay, so
yeah,
a little bit of patience with these technicalities, but we can definitely start. It's 3 minutes past 6, so we can slowly start also because we know that Malcolm is a bit busy today, and so we don't want to take too much of his time. So very well, uh, dear all, a very warm welcome to this fifth lecture in our Radical Environmental Humanities series with Professor Malcolm Ferdinand. My name is Mark Armiero, and I am the editor-in-chief of Resistance, a journal of radical environmental humanities. I am coordinating this series of lectures, as you know, if you have been watching us, with Lizzie Privitera from the University of Toronto and Nuno Marquez from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. And this lecture and all the series is co-hosted by Resistance and by the Institute for History of Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. Lizzie will introduce our guest speaker today. Nuno will say a few words about the lecture series, and I will take a moment to introduce our journal. But first of all, I would like to thank Malcolm Ferdinand and all our speakers for the generosity in accepting our invitation. At this moment, our lecture have reached about 1,000 people, 970 more or less. So evidently, ideas for resistance are highly needed at the moment. Resistance is a relatively new journal, previously titled Resilience. I changed its name when I became editor-in-chief to reflect on a new intellectual and political agenda, while Resilience focuses on enduring stresses and returning to the prior state. Resistance is about fighting back and changing the conditions that cause crisis. Allow me to quote here from our distinguished guest today. In his book, The Colonial Ecology, Malcolm Ferdinand writes, and I'm quoting from Malcolm now, the Caribbean allows for a conceptualization of the ecological crisis that is embedded within the search for a world free of its slavery, its social violence, and its political injustice, a decolonial ecology. This decolonial ecology is a path charted aboard the world ship towards the horizon of a common world, towards what I call a worldly ecology, end quote. Our aim as Resistance is to become a reference point for radical scholarship in the environmental humanities. And if you are wondering what is radical in the environmental humanities, our working definition is that radical environmental humanities include any approach that questions the current state of society and academia, stands in solidarity with grassroots movements and oppressed subjects, and contributes to research fostering more just socio-ecological relationships. But more than a definition, for us, radicality is a starting point for a collective quest. And this lecture series and this lecture today is part of our shared research journey. And I give you the floor, Nuno.
thank you. Hello, everyone. Just very briefly to say that this is the fifth lecture in our series that has been taking place once a month since last year and will go until June this year. The lecture series Resistance brings together a community of radical scholars to share ideas, stories, and dreams for the world we need. We are happy to have such incredible speakers in this series and invite you to their coming lectures, which are, and I will now announce them. So on February 11, Nidvedita Menon, March 18, Eric Swingadal, April 10, Nmimo Basse, May 20, Stefania Barca, and June 25, Raul Zibecki. Like Marco said, you can find the lecture program with detailed information in the Facebook page of the Resistance Journal and at the webpage of the Institute for the History of Science and at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So now I give the floor to Lizzie. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Nuno. My name is Liz Vitera. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto, and I am a member of the collective at Resistance Journal. So I am here to introduce today's speaker, Professor Malcom Ferdinand, and help to moderate the Q&A. So Malcom Ferdinand is a researcher at the National Center of the Scientific Research. He obtained his PhD with laude in political science and political philosophy at the Université Paris Diderot in 2016 with a dissertation on contemporary ecological conflicts in the Caribbean. Through empirical research on 4 islands, specifically Martinique, Guadeloupe, Haiti, and Puerto Rico, Malcom examined the way current ecological conflicts bring to the 4 demands of social and environmental justice from the inhabitant, who criticize the current political relationship with the metropolitan power. Combining historical, socio-ecological, literary approaches, Malcom has developed a theory of Caribbean post-colonial ecological faults, one that articulates the imperative of nature and cultural heritage preservation and political claims of equality. His book, which I will say in English, the title, I won't avoid to say in French with my bad pronunciation, which is Decolonial Ecology, Thinking from the Caribbean World, has been first published in France, in French language, but then a bit translated in many languages, including English, Italian, Spanish. And today's seminar, we delve into this research and we look forward to his insights. Before we begin, please submit your comments and questions on our Facebook page or our YouTube channel during the talk. You and I will share your questions during the Q&A session, and I'm looking forward to hear from you, Marco. So thank you for your attention. Ferdinand, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nuno. Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Lizzie, for this great invitation. It's always a pleasure to be part of a radical environmental thought or initiative. I hope you can hear me well. It is also a way to test. And thank you to all of you who are listening or will be listening. It's a bit special not to be able to see you, but if you want to comment, I think Nuno and Lizzie will help moderate, and I'll be very happy to exchange and respond to some of the questions or remark. So as we agreed, I would speak for about 45 minutes. If I go over, I count on Marco and Lizzie, Nuno, to tell me. And so that we have time to share. Now I have prepared a PowerPoint, and I'll share it with you now. Normally you should see it. Is it the case?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
thank you. Thank you, because when I see my screen, then I don't see you anymore. But so in this short talk, I will talk about my my current work or latest work, which deals with a pesticide chemical contamination of 2 islands, Martinique and Guadeloupe. This is the main line, and you could say it's a way to apply some of the theoretical work that I've done in my previous work into a case study. But this is the layout of my presentation. I will say a few words about where I'm from, and then there'll be 4 parts. The first part will come back to my previous work on what I call the double fracture of modernity. And then the next 3 parts will focus on a specific case. Part 2, we look at the classical narrative about the case. Part 3 on the type of work that I'm trying to do about this case, and part 4 will focus on 2 aspects that are, I think, very important: the coloniality in arts and science, into the narrative we use to tell a story. And then just a few concluding remarks. Now, where do I speak from? One thing that I want to emphasize is I am Martinican. Even before being a researcher, I'm a Martinican researcher. Here you have a map of where Martinique and Guadeloupe are, which are part of what we call the non-sovereign territories of France, the equivalent of Puerto Rico and Hawaii for the US. And these have been colonies of France, where most of their slave-making practices happen. In terms of my academic background, I work both in political philosophy and political science, even though I have a background in environmental engineering. And the one thing I'm speaking to you now from France, Paris, and one thing I like to specify is the fact that I'm a black man, middle class, sure, but in a mainly and predominantly white French academia. It's a joke saying that it's a rare but endemic species, but it points out to the type of pressures, intimidations, violence that you may face as you try to produce knowledge about a situation, even when it's about your home island or your home bodies. Here, you have just a few op-eds, journal papers that happened 4 or 5 years ago when I published my first book, but describe the kind of public outcry, the public context of basically right-wing commentators that try to demonize scholars like myself who engage in work that has to do with the colonial heritage, the slavery heritage, or racism, and even gender studies. So this is just to exemplify what I was saying about being a white man in French academia. That is engaging in work where you don't know how it will affect, how it be received, whether you have the rights to engage in this work or not. No. And here you have a map of the quote-unquote anti-enlightenment movement in France. And one of the, I don't know if you can see it, but one of the poll here called is a decolonial ecology poll. So this term is becoming officially an anti-enlightenment movement in France. Well, now let's get to my research. In 2019 and in 2021 in English, I published this book called Decolonial Ecology: Thinking from the Caribbean World. The nature of the endeavor that I wanted to do in this book, I didn't entitle it the Caribbean ecology. That is, you take concepts that are thought to be produced from the West or in Europe or elsewhere, and you apply it to the Caribbean and say, oh, let's analyze the unequal exchange, the pollutions, or the movements. The major shift that I wanted to offer in this first book was to really challenge the way in which we can conceive, conceptualize, problematize the ecological crisis and the concepts that can be derived from thinking from the Caribbean world. The idea that a thought can happen in the Caribbean was not something that was a given. The Caribbean was perceived to be a place, a region where you'd have the indigenous people that have been colonized, sometimes that endure genocide. You have been enslaved, and all the non-white people did not have the recognition that they could speak, write, and produce their own thoughts. And this is the main idea, let's say, or gesture endeavor. But the start of his book, to start this book, I start by this concept of double fracture of modernity. What I just want to precise this because it will help understand where I go forward after that. And what I mean by that is, in my research, in my 15, almost 20 years of research on environmental issues, I found that there was a major divide that I try to explain in these two different tables. A divide between two groups, at least two groups. A group of people that would be scholars, academic professors, politicians that would engage with what I call the environmental fracture, the way humans, quote unquote, humans have destroyed the planet, ecosystems, and try very creatively to reverse the hierarchy, trying to stop the damage that humans. But behind these humans, usually they have a certain idea of who is human, of who, what are the societies they are talking about. And in this, on the left side of a picture, and in this group, you rarely find a sustained, serious engagement with racism, coloniality, slavery, and their heritage. On the right side of this picture, you'd have another fracture, the colonial fracture. And in my experience, in my work, in my also militant activist life, I've met and encountered scholars and activists that engage with this colonial fracture, the legacy of coloniality, of colonization, of racism, anti-racism, and even in their complex form, including Afrofeminism. And I found that in that the people that were engaging in that with that colonial fracture sometimes maybe marginalize a little bit the environmental conditions of a struggle. That is the ecological question. And that divide is what I call the double fracture of modernity. The fact that either you would read some John Muir or some even Bruno Latour and think about all the genuine and rich ways in which you can deal with the environment, but then you had to quiet down or mask the legitimate decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-racist politics. So decolonial ecology is really trying to bridge that double fracture, to think together both the environmental conditions of life on Earth as well as the demand for reparation, the demand for anti-racism and decolonial justice. But that divide is not just a political one, it's also an epistemological one. That means it will really challenge the way we understand a certain issue or certain problem, including an environmental problem. And that is where I want to bring you into this particular case that I worked on in my recent book. Now, to give you an idea of that divide before we go on is, if you take the idea of France, for example, here you have a picture of the COP21 when Holland was president and the Paris Accord was signed. And if I ask most people, where is France on a map? Many people say, oh, it's a continental part of Europe, here, as you can see. But very rarely you would see all the other non-sovereign territories that are also part of France and that were also involved in that Paris Accord. And this is an example of the colonial fracture that still affects the way we think about, at least about France. Now, here I will talk about this case, and the way I will present you this case is by using this classical narrative, the environmentalist classical narrative. Here you have two maps of the waters that have been contaminated by this compound called chlordécone. It's a chemical compound. It's an organochlorine, the same family as DDT. and but has been used. Here you have a map that tells, but has been used for 20 years, from the 1970s to 1980s in the Antilles, in les Antilles, as you say in French. I haven't changed the slide. And that use in the banana plantations of Martinique and Guadeloupe created a generalized, long-lasting, and harmful contamination. On the right here, you have a map of the land that has been contaminated. And the length of the contamination is estimated to be between decades and centuries, as much as 7 centuries. It has contaminated the land, some vegetables, some animals, and humans, of course, as well as the water. And it's an endocrine disruptor as well as a carcinogenic agent. Here are a few more information. I will just focus on the health part of it. The research so far has shown that the exposition to this particular compound reduces the length of pregnancy, delays the motor, cognitive, and visual development of children, and also increases your chance of having, for men, particularly prostate cancer, but also of having the French word is récidive, but as the cancer can start again. And that's what we know. And of course, as you know, there are biases in the research. So a lot more research has been done on what it does to men, but less so on what it does to women. And ongoing research are happening regarding the health of women, including issues such as, again, I'm sorry about my French, but it's the name in French is endometriose, which is heavy, really a lot of pain during your period. Now, this is usually the way this story is being told. There was a economy, agricultural economy, plantations. We used the wrong compound and it created all these problems. And in that classical narrative, the idea that it's become only an environmental affair, something, even a French parliamentary report in 2019 said that it was a environmental accident. I translated this that we should not paint a bleak picture. And again, I want to pay attention to the phrasing here. It's not the fault of chlordécone. It's just that it's trapped in the soil. And along this line, you also have the French president, the current as well, Macron, who say that tries to minimize the health consequences. We should not say that it's carcinogenic because it creates fear and it's false and so on and so forth. The consequence of that framing is that it puts the fault, the guilt on a particular on the living earth. In all, when people are trying to explain in documentaries, in scientific research paper, why did we use this compound? The narrative is always almost because of this particular insect. The Latin word is Cosmopolites sordidus. It's a banana weevil that you find basically on all tropical areas of the earth, and that happens to lay its egg in the stem of the banana plants. But this is the reason why we use this contamination. They talk about the tropical climates. There are hurricanes that sometimes will provide a lot of humidity, will push down some of the banana plantations and offer more materials, and the insects will kind of develop too much. Sometimes it's the fault of the soil that is has a high organic content concentration, and that helps trap the chlordécone. So this is the classical environmentalist narrative. And the result is that it creates a depoliticizing narratives that suits the current order, that suits the order of racial capitalism and what I call colonial inhabitation of Martinique and Guadeloupe. That means the idea that these islands, as it was decided in the 17th century when they were colonized by the French Richelieu and the West Indies Company of France, that these islands' sole purpose, these islands' sole destiny is to be a bunch of monoculture export crops whose function is to provide exotic goods for the European mainlands, but not necessarily provide food sovereignty, safety, and dignity to the people living in these islands. Now, this is the quote-unquote classical narrative. We don't talk about the constitution of the banana industry, the fact that it's 95% of what's produced is exported to quote-unquote mainland France. That's the thing that has been hidden. Now, this book, C'est la terre faire face à l'habité colonial in French, which in English could be translated, it's being translated now as Loving Ourselves the Earth, Undoing the Colonial Inhabitation, is the result of my deep dive into this case. And to give you a bit of background on how this book came to be and about my research. Of course, as you may have noticed in my presentation, I try to stay away from that perspective where the scientist that is producing knowledge about a place never tells the story of his or her own body, as if they are speaking from the eye of God. And the first thing I need to say about this research is that it's a research about my hometown, my home place, my home island. And doing research on this contamination is also uncovering my own contamination by this compound. But beside that, I've done research, interdisciplinary research on this case for 14 years. I started in 2009. And what I mean by interdisciplinary is I still maintain my frame as a political scientist and political philosopher of trying to understand what that what that contamination tells about the way the world is organized, is structured, is shaped, especially from the Martinique and Guadeloupean experience. But I engage in a dialogue with all the other scientific disciplines, or at least many, and what they have to say about this story. So disciplines such as epidemiology, biology, agronomy, but also law. And all of this is in an effort to provide a rather comprehensive understanding of this story. I also position myself as I would not say an activist per se, but an engaged researcher. In the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, she wrote, a beautiful collection of her work in abolition geography. She said that she writes so that we fight better. Writing allows her to understand some of the cases, situations we have to face, and her horizon in writing is to provide us with the tools to better fight. And I really follow in her steps. That means that I am part of different collectives in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, and here in mainland France but are engaged in fighting in court this case. I'm also a plaintiff in a court case, in 2 court cases against the French state. Um, um, but beside my activist involvement, I'm also in governmental spaces. The government has initiated an inter-ministerial plan to deal with this contamination. And in doing so, the French government, established a kind of scientific council that is supposed to help or provide advices. And I'm part of this council. Even though my voice there is very limited, I'm considered a new, a rookie who doesn't know much about life, blah, 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 and also one of the only Black person there, of course. Now, what I try to do in this book, I will not be able to summarize the main points, but what I try to do is to provide a more complex and political narrative that challenges the current racist, patriarchal, and capitalist order, from which that compound comes from. If I were to summarize, the environmentalist narrative puts the fault on that compound, on that chlordecone. And it's very nice to do from the perspective of the government, because then if you remove the compound, then you solve the issue. My goal is actually to locate this compound in a myriad of relationships, and I argue that we will not solve this case if we don't address all of these relationships that made this contamination possible in the first place. So, and one of the starting points is, to me, the relationship with the living. There is a tendency to look at this case as only a environmental contamination, or let's say a very homogenizing and somewhat too much simplistic narrative about what's happening to the living space, the living environment. And in doing my research, I realized that at least this compound is not only found in humans, but it is found in more than 100 vegetal species, including plants, marine plants, some fruits and vegetables, of course, algae, but also in more than 177 animal species. And so one of my suggestions is that we should change the frame of just the human that is being affected by this chloric compound, but really looking at it as affecting the web of life, the living part of the earth, including turtles, fish, chickens, and all. We find chlordecone from the smallest insect, this banana weevil, all the way to the to Moby Dick. Sorry, I forgot the name in English. Cachalot.
Whales.
Yeah,
Whales.
whales. This sperm whales. Yes, sperm whales. This is a particular type of whale. Thank you. So this is the breath, and including to birds, etc. That's one of the ways I try to provide a different narrative. Of course, looking at the political aspect of it, but not just in terms of economy, but also pointing out the racist nature of this economy and its relationship to land ownership. And I'll give you an example with that. As the banana industry in Martinique and Guadeloupe uses a lot of marketing strategies to legitimize its business, and also to quiet down any critics. And this was an advert that you'd see in 2012 in the airport of Martinique, and I took some pictures. I could have taken many other examples, but this example is quite telling. And of course, they will always situate the racialized men and women within the fields, and claiming that they are, of course, engaged and for the environment, committed to this banana productions. And there are many other instances. But the difference in the only white person that is there has a reference to knowledge. So there is already the idea that there is a racialized distribution of who gets knowledge, who gets to do the labor. But what I didn't tell you about Martinique and Guadeloupe is this this case is also a case about whiteness, and this book is also a contribution to critical whiteness studies. Martinique and Guadeloupe has a particular sociological or socio-racial composition, particular in that the former slave owners and colonists have, through an endogamic practice, have maintained a tight social group that has huge economic power. One of the roots of its economic power can be traced to the way to colonization. First of all, when Martinique and Guadeloupe were colonized, only white men could possess the land. And pass it on only to white men. But when slavery was abolished, as it happened in the UK, as it happened in the States, the abolition of slavery, and there were two in the case of France, was not a form of justice for the former enslaved. And I like to stress this for many people: the abolition of slavery is not a justice, is not a form of justice. Of course, it was needed, and it was better to not have, as in the law, the right to own and dehumanize people. But it's not necessarily the case that the enslaved themselves got justice for the crime that they endured. On the contrary, the former masters received compensation. That is, in the eye of the French law, the abolition of slavery was an injustice onto the former masters because they were being spoiled of their own possessions. And so in 1849, as much as 7% of the entire French budget was used to compensate financially the former white masters, so that the abolition of slavery was adopted on the condition that the former white master could maintain their capital. And that allowed them to maintain possession, ownership of the land, ownership of factories and mills, and enough capital to launch and create this banana plantation and banana industry. And of course, my argument in the book is that we cannot understand the question of the contamination if we do not understand the racialized and discriminatory relationship to land ownership and to the economy. And one of the third instances, because there are other forms of discrimination, is the relationship with justice. Since 2006, collectives in Guadeloupe and Martinique have gone to the court and denounced this crime. The fact that they are being contaminated by a carcinogenic, an endocrine disruptor, while they had no say in the use of this endocrine disruptor. And the court, after 17 years of process, said that there was nobody guilty. No company, no officials, no one has been found guilty of a contamination that affects more than 90% of the people, that may stay there for more than many centuries, that creates, maybe induces or help induce cancer, and that you find in the umbilical cord of Martinique and Guadeloupe. So in a sense, in 2023, when they gave the results, the French justice system explained that the contamination of the Martinican people and the Guadeloupean people and the entire or their ecosystem is perfectly in accordance with the French law. It was completely legal to contaminate us. So of course, this decision is very disturbing. But if you look at the colonial way in which it was done, the judge in 17 years of process never once made the trip from Paris to Martinique and Guadeloupe because the case has been delocalized in Paris. That means that while there is a tribunal, a penal court in Martinique, and there is also one in Guadeloupe, the case was delocalized or transferred to Paris, so that the people that have gone to the court, if they want to have access to the places or to the spaces where their own demand for justice is being talked about, they cannot enter, or they have to pay thousands of euros to cross the ocean. And even when they cross the ocean, they cannot enter the court. As I said, I am myself a plaintiff. And yet I'm not allowed, I am not authorized to enter into the discussion. So when you look at the process itself, it is again a manifestation of the French coloniality towards this island, where we are being stripped of our own demands of justice in a language that is solely French. We also speak Creole. And so the result is a justice that is given from afar in a very vertical, dominating manner, and that has the opposite effect. That is, it furthers the dehumanization of the Martinican people and Guadeloupean people. Now, these are some of the interventions that I'm trying to do in this book, and I do much more. I want to focus in the last part on two aspects, or something that occurred to me but I've never thought about before until I did this work, or that I hadn't thought in this way. Here you have a graving by the enslaved woman called Anastasia in the 18th century that was painted by a French painter, I forgot his name, with a piece in her mouth that is meant to prevent her from eating. But I like to take this as also a way that prevents her from speaking. And the question is, when you have such cases, who gets to tell the narrative? Who gets to produce the science that will enable people to problematize the issue? And what I found was that whiteness was also at its at play there. Here, so you have examples of 3 documentaries that were published, that were produced on the case. In 2024, so last year, 6 producers or directors contacted me saying, "Hey, we want to do a documentary on this issue." All 6 of them said they were the first to do it, which is not the case. and they all wanted me to be someone to be interviewed. And when I responded to one of them, for example, one of them had already sold to the French national TV that I would be in the documentary, while that person had not contacted me before anyway. And when I say, okay, I would like to participate, but since I've been working on this for 14 years, I would like to have a say in the narrative. And that person just laughed at me when I met him. He just laughed at me. It was, and many of his documentaries do not come from Martinique and Guadeloupean people, and are not meant. That means maintain a very violent ownership of the means to produce their own stories. Of course, you have in art, you have a lot of music and sculptures that try to tell the story, but there is a form of the word in English, I think it's trauma porn, a form of pornography of the black body trauma, where the black body is maintained in a space where that body can cry, can scream, can shout, but is not seen as having the authority to write, to tell, to conceptualize their own situations. And that has been a shock to me. And this is a case of very, very intense violence, in the sense that many producers and many art practitioners who say, well, your suffering becomes our terra incognita. Your suffering becomes the material for our story. And in that story, you are to be just a material. But what has changed in my going from a student to a professor and being employed in a scientific institution is I got to see how sciences and how research is being created, financed, elaborated, organized. And here on the left, you have the first major conference on chlordécone in Martinique. And this is a room in a hotel, I mean, I said the hotel, but it's actually a beach resort. Most of the conferences, scientific conferences in Martinique and Guadeloupe, happens in beach resorts. The first lines are usually occupied by white people coming from mainland France, and the rest of the room is occupied by the racialized part of the population. But you have to bear in mind that Martinique and Guadeloupe have universities, and they have theaters and places and classrooms where you have a vibrant youth, a lot of students that are engaging in all sorts of disciplines. But the choice to put a conference in a hotel where the relationships from the white person coming from mainland France to Martinique and Guadeloupe with the other racialized and black people will be one of service, and not one where you have to exchange on a quote unquote horizontal level. That is an aspect of coloniality and whiteness here, and so you have a scientific activity that has been developed, maintained, sustained, encouraged within a circle of whiteness, where the population, that is the people that have been exposed, those that have suffered the most under this pesticide have no say, and none of the publication is being translated into their own language, including the Creole. So on the right side of this slide, you have how you call it a workers collective that had on the bottom you have a picture of the demonstration in 1974. 2 years after they started using this compound, there was a major agricultural movement by the workers in Martinique that demanded the end of the use of this pesticide. And the response of the state, after many days of strike, was sending the military force, killing at least 2 people, injuring countless others. And in the end, the demand to remove this compound was not met. That is, the possibility to maintain the exposition of Martinican and in the case Guadeloupean also people to this pesticide was the use of deadly force, and the use of deadly force in total impunity. That means nobody, no people were condemned, not of the murders, not of the poisoning itself. So yeah, this is one aspect that I think. So it is, to me, impossible to talk about this contamination if we don't challenge the social spaces of sciences, but also the epistemology of sciences themselves. That's I will leave for one of the most strange case is this case here. You have a paper that suggested that to decontaminate the land, we should just microwave it. Of course, not like the microwave you have in your home, but you should just microwave it. Okay. But what is even more disturbing that that person on that research team had no incentive and no need to offer the possibility of Martinican and Guadeloupean people not only to have access to this publication, but also to discuss it with the Martinican and Guadeloupean people. I, as a scientist, had to pay to get access to this paper. So this is an aspect that you can't remove from the conceptualization of this contamination, because the result is that the scientists that derived and invented this compound and that promoted its use in the 1960s, 1970s was structured by whiteness. And what you find that the scientists that are studying the consequences of this pesticide are also structured by whiteness. So in a sense, the Martinican and Guadeloupean people still remain excluded from the scientific knowledge-making practices that allow them to have information about the contamination of their own islands and own bodies. I will move because I want to go to the concluding remarks. Let's say, oh, I lacked a slide, sorry. But to conclude on this part, one of the propositions in my book is to engage into clearly decolonial sciences. That involves changing the compositions of who constitute the body of researchers. We know, especially from Naomi Oreskes, but others, that the greater the variety of researchers there is, the greater the quality of the research. That we need to have research made also in our own languages. We need to have a local sovereignty on the research. That means that a researcher can no longer come in Martinique and Guadeloupe like as if it were the Far West, and being able to take any samples they want, and or any materials, and not have the need to give back. That means to present back the research to the people that allowed the research to exist. And of course, a few other ideas. And I'll stop on that part, and that story. That's now the last story I tell, which is the cover of my book. Here is a picture of the remains of a statue, the statue of a former of the former wife of Napoleon de Bonaparte, Joséphine de Bonaparte, who was a defendant of a proponent of slavery. Some even argue that she helped convince Napoleon to re-establish slavery in 1802 because it was ended in 1794. But basically, that statue represents the coloniality of France in Martinique. But and in 2020, even during the or before the Black Lives Matter movement worldwide, local collectives uprooted, destroyed that colonial symbol, and created a form of permaculture device, or not device, but system around it. There was a bit dry, but before there was just some, there was soil, some tomatoes and other vegetables, and on the planks in front of it, you have Creole writings, calling or homage, paying homage to nature, to our ancestors, calling for alliances, for decolonization, praising life. And I think that process where the uprooting of the colonial symbol or the colonial inhabitation of the world, of the earth, is what allows for a reconnection to the earth. That's what I found symbolically very powerful, and I will just end my presentation here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Malcolm, very much. Very provoking, and I also want to really, I feel the need to say that I see so much of communalities between our work, the work that we are trying to do with the resistance community. I was thinking, just to mention a few things, when you said now that these people with documentaries, they are taking control of the narratives. No, they want you like a suffering body. I was thinking about something that I have been repeating often. No, this idea that we knew that we needed to take control of the means of production, but maybe we underestimated the relevance of taking control of the means of production, reproduction of stories. And sometimes I have the feeling that missing that part meant also to miss the possibility for telling a different story and building a different narrative. But I mean, of course, I'm also buying a little bit of time. So I don't know if Lizzie and Nuno, you see anything in the chat, because otherwise I also have a question. Unless you have any, I don't want to occupy any space.
There is no any questions yet, so I think we can proceed with our conversation and see if someone wants to share any questions later.
Very good. Okay, so as I was saying, precisely, these communalities, there is also an issue that I was thinking when you mentioned, the positionality, the fact that you are not talking from, like the God's trick. You mentioned this, and it was also something that we wrote ourselves in our manifesto. Stefania Barca, Irina Veliku, and I, we wrote a manifesto on undisciplining environmental political ecology, and we said that in order to be undisciplined, you also need to be naked, in a sense, to be to expose yourself. And I am very grateful that you decide to do that today. My question, I think for me it's a very difficult question, so don't be upset with me. I am not looking for an answer, but maybe for brainstorming with you. But I feel, I don't know if you agree with me, I feel like a friction, you may say contradiction, between realizing the oppression of the colonial and I would say capitalist state and the attempt to ask for justice from the state, for instance, through the court, through the law system. And I mean, I hope that you are not taking this like, you know, I am saying that it's a it's like your contradiction. It's our contradiction, I think, no? And I would like if you can talk with us today about this. How do you feel it? If you want to share some ideas, because I think it's something that we are many times we have been discussing among us. I remember a wonderful debate between Laura Pulido and by the way, Laura was also here with us. She opened our series, and David Pello, who is a member of the collective. You know what to do with with the state when we are asking for justice. And I don't know if you want to share something. Again, I am not, you know, asking you to solve the issue, but maybe just, you know, how can I say, share with us the what you think about this problem, maybe. Malcolm, we cannot. At least I cannot hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, I think this is an important question, and I think the question will take different routes and forms depending on the context. So, for example, in the States, it might be different, and what is in Italy, Spain, or in that case in France, and particularly in the overseas territories of France. So you have to imagine that the idea of a state, of what a state and the function of a state is in Martinique and Guadeloupe, has been inseparable from coloniality. The state, I'm not saying that the previous inhabitants, the Caribs, the Arawak, the Tainos, the Kalinago, the Kalina didn't have social structures, infrastructures, and institutions. Of course, they did. But the idea of a state, as a national state, in particular in France, was an idea that was already seen as colonial. So that, and to me, it is problematic because, and in my work, I'm trying to remove the idea of a state or the state from the colonial. And that's why my book is in 5 parts, sorry, and the 5th part is really a number of propositions, and I argue for the need for different forms of sovereignty, including in the justice court. So, and the kind of contradiction or aporia that you find in the justice system is evident. Let's say this particular justice process had condemned a company or some people. Would that be enough? In a sense that would that process be any more humanizing? And I don't think that's the case. I think there is a use in still using any tool we have to fight, and if that means using the own justice theoretical law, we will. But I also think in a greater picture, we need to have a form of collective justice, a collective system that is born and raised and organized by the Martinique and Guadeloupean people themselves in their own language, which would recognize that, like any other human beings, we have the ability to judge. We have an idea of what justice is. We are able to have contradictory dialogues, debates, and institutions. But that idea is such a this is one of the problem of colonialism, is the idea that either you have the colonial state, either you have nothing, and that without the colonial state, you cannot exist. By the way, these were the exact words of the French President Emmanuel Macron a few weeks ago in December when he went to the island of Mayotte in the in Indian Ocean. Mayotte is part of the Comoros archipelago, and you had a major hurricane that destroyed a large part of Mayotte infrastructures, many deaths, and people living in shacks that have been heavily affected by it. And the French president in 2024 goes there a week after, and one of the first dialogue he has is he calls out the people of Mayotte and say, "Hey, be lucky you are part of France, because if you were not part of France, you would be 10,000 times in deeper shit." That was his presidential words. And of course, you can see the parallel with a Trump that goes to Puerto Rico and send out paper towels. But and so it's the coloniality that tries to make us think that without France, we would be nothing. And so I argue I'm in favor of having at least different forms of sovereignty in terms of our justice system, in terms of our institutions, and in terms of our research. And why not? Because I think there is a we can have a Martinican state, and we can still have social movements and criticism of the state, even when the state will be Martinican. And have debate or whether we want a society without a state or whether we want different forms, but at least we'll have the chance to just do what all the other societies of the world do: organize ourselves, decide for ourselves what institutions, what forms our lives we want to take. And in that particular instance, we do not have the possibility to do it.
Thank you, Malcolm, and I am very grateful for this conversation. I completely agree with you. I like the idea of the barricades, and you when you build the barricades, you use whatever it's at your disposal, no? And let be also a court if this is what is needed. I am not a purist in this sense. If the workers are going to court to prove that they have been contaminated and killed by a corporation, I think that they should. Was my point. I think that it's precisely as you said. That we try to do what we can with the means that we have at our disposal, without missing the point about the structural injustice that the system is reproducing. But I am very happy because I see there are questions, Nuno and Lizzie, in the chat. Maybe we can share with Malcolm some.
Yes, I can go. Thank you, by the way, Malcom Ferdinand. Was very, very interesting your speech, your talk. So from Gennaro Vallone, he said, "Great conference. I have a question about freedom movement to know if Malcolm recognizes the freedom of movement as a fundamental claim for the current environmental justice movement."
So thank you for this question. When you talk about, because there's also a language barrier here for me. When you talk about freedom of movement, you talk about the movement for freedom or the possibility to move freely?
The possibility to move freely, I think.
Okay, that's
Gennaro. I hope that Gennaro would agree with me. But I think speaking about the possibility to move. And Gennaro, if I'm wrong, please, stop me on the chat.
Yeah. Of course, I mean, there are questions behind these questions. So I published. So this book came out in October. That's my book here. It's fairly generous in its length, and I presented it to Guadeloupe and Martinique in December, and I did one conference at the university, and I was saying that if I had stayed in Guadeloupe or in Martinique, I would not have the possibility to write this book, which was sad and painful to me. So of course, I believe that inhabiting Martinique Guadeloupe means you must have the possibility to go and travel to different places, experiences, not just to France or the US, but to Brazil, to Saint Lucia. That we need to remove some of the colonial barriers. You have to imagine that the Caribbean was never meant to be separated by all these different colonial languages, Spanish, English, French. That the indigenous people use different canoe to travel, to go to weddings, to go and hand together in ceremonies, etc. And that's the very concept of archipelago. But because of a colonial complex that we've been brainwashed with, sometimes we are taught to see the people that are trying to whether it's from the other sovereign territories like St. Lucia, Barbados, Haiti, or Brazil in French Guiana. Sometimes you do have some xenophobia. And so we are taught to see the foreigners as being less than ourselves. And why so? Just because we are part of France. So there's also a problem there. Another way to respond to your question is which is there are different theories and movements travel differently according to the context. So if you were to ask, okay, what became of the environmental justice movement in France? We know that you have the roots in 1970s and 80s in the US, but you have different branch in Central and South America, in South Africa, in Asia, but what became of France, or even in the UK? And it's a very amusing subject because the notion of the environmental justice movement in France was stripped of its anti-colonial and anti-racist dimensions. So you would literally have scholars saying, well, it was born in US, where there is slavery and where there was racism and so forth. But here in France, we'll only talk about inequality and different access to environmental goods, environmental yields, etc. So there you see that there is so talking about whiteness, talking about anti-racism, talking about decoloniality is harder to do in Martinique and Guadeloupe because of this French coloniality, whereas it should be the place at the forefront of that issue. And this is even more disturbing because most of you know these spaces because of the great thinkers that came out of that. Maryse Condé, one of the most important writer of the region, is from Guadeloupe. Frantz Fanon, one of the most important figure in post-colonial thought, is from Martinique. Edouard Glissant, a famous theorist and philosopher, we talk about colonization, and is from Martinique. And yet, the places where you want to speak about some of these issues is where it's harder. It's there, but that's another thing. Maybe I'll just go and answer the other question directly from Gavin, who questioned if I asked if I could talk about the Creole language in Martinique. So thank you for this question, because this is actually this has been a very important part for me. And even as I tried to write this book, and I criticized the use or the exclusive use of French, and yet I write the book in French. But what I did is I actually inserted different parts in Creole. And even the name Creole, sometimes people dispute that. It's another story. But if you recall, I showed you the picture of some agricultural workers. If you come to Martinique and you go to a football game, if you go to the beach, if you go dancing, if you listen to music, if you go work in the field, if you go, if you to listen to some radio, if you go planting, if you go and do all these activities that are part of what inhabiting the earth is, most of these activities will be done in Creole. That means that the earth itself is being practiced and understood in Creole. But yet, as long as you would want to have a discourse, authoritative discourse in courts, at school, in the administration, then you use the French. And so, and of course in science. And that is again a continuation of the colonial practice here. I'm not saying we should get rid of French. French is also one of my mother tongue, and I write and express myself in French. But I'm saying maybe we could diversify, multiply, and I think, of course, of the famous and great writer and thinker Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who wrote this book, Decolonizing the Mind, paying attention to the language. And that does not mean that simply using the Korean language is in itself decolonial enough, because you can still produce a research that is destructive of the environment, that is capitalistic, that is dehumanizing in Creole. But it's an important step. It's an important step. Are there parallel to the DPCP in Ecuador and Nicaragua? There are to some extent. The first one, I can think of two parallels. The contexts are much different, politically wise. I think Ecuador and Nicaragua also have to deal a lot more with multinationals, where the banana industry in France is really helped and fostered by the French state. So it's not the same stakeholders. And in Ecuador is the country that exports most of the desert bananas. In terms of geography, the major difference would be the nature of the exposition. It's bad in all places, but in Martinique, you do not have, or in Guadeloupe, you do not have the vast fields of bananas where you see no houses. These are small islands that are densely populated. So you have a banana field here, you have a school there, you have a residence there, you have a football pitch there, so that the exposition, because of the tight, the smallness of a territory, is, I would say, closer. But of course, regarding the banana workers, it's the same. And one other thing, I know in the case of I think it was Nicaragua in the DBCP, we noticed that it induces male infertility. And in fact, it was this result that led some of the first epidemiologists to only look at male problems regarding the chloroquine effect. But it's rated, of course, it's rated. Another question from Jonathan Palmblad. Okay. Do you find the critique of anthropocentrism helpful, or does it fall into the trap of the world fracture? I'm thinking of Ramachandra Ragua, third world critique of US typology. No, the critique of Gua is, of course, very important. I'm also thinking of the critique of Jean Martinez Allier when he talks about the cult of wilderness. Let's just say that there is a critique of anthropocentrism that can still if the critique of anthropocentrism maintains as at its core the idea of a homogeneous human, then it reproduces the coloniality that I'm trying to undo. But I think, and there are, if you think of thinkers such as Pauline Gims, I think, there are a decolonial way of criticizing anthropocentrism that just does not reduce the human and the anthropos as one single entity. And in fact, there are forms, yeah. So what I would say is that it's not necessarily the case that it falls into the trap of the ball fracture. It has been historically the case. But what is the overarching problem? It has to do with the way, as especially maybe people in the West, but mostly also in Europe, how do European societies and even the US and Canada inherit from the story of colonization, patriarchal colonization, capitalism, and imperialism? But I want to focus on colonization and slavery. And I'm not a specialist of all these contexts, but I've been living in France for some time. I'm a French citizen, even though I'm also Martinican. And what I found is that there is a profound misconception of what should be done. There is an idea that if you simply pass a law, for example, for the abolition of slavery, or a law that we recognize these former territories as part of France, overseas territories, then you would have done all that is needed to inherit from these spaces. And what you find is that in France, you reproduce the same colonial ways that was there. Because a simple law is not going to change a way of doing things, a way of relating, an imaginary of spaces. And in my book, I also argue for the need for decolonial relations that last in time. The colonial imaginary was not made just by one law. It's a set of concepts, ideas, policies, language, and a whole imaginary that was sedimented for centuries. So it would take a long time to see, for example, a black man as bearer of knowledge. In my own university, if I stay too long at the entrance of university, at some point a student is going to come and is going to open his bag and put it in my face and say, "Sir, please check my bag." Of course he will do that because that's what is being shown. And the other people, the people that are doing the security, they have their uniform with the name of the company that does the security. I don't have a uniform, or at least I don't have a clothes uniform, but I have another uniform, and that student doesn't need to look at it to see that, okay, that body, my body, is not the one that will teach me something, but he's the one that will protect my body on the way to access the knowledge. So it's much deeper, and it has to do with the way our institutions is organized, the way our political system is organized. And so it's a long battle, and I'm just trying to contribute a little bit with this book.
Thank you, Malcolm. There is a question in Facebook that maybe I can share. I couldn't copy and paste because it's a bit long. It's from Ilenia Yengo, and Ilenia is saying, "Thank you, Malcolm, for this presentation, for your work. I am myself a scholar and an activist working on the political nexus between health and environment and the epistemological violence in environmental sciences concerning whose knowledge and embodiment get writer. Ilenia said, I found much inspiration from Afro-feminist speculative and visionary fiction work to help channel imaginaries into social justice organizing, in order not to center only the damages done to the web of life, but also the emancipatory potential rooted in communities fighting against violence. So the question is, could you maybe share your reflections about the role of knowledge production centering futurity, sorry for my English, and speculation to your work and movements that fight against colonialism, racism, patriarchy in Martinique, Guadeloupe? So the reflection on the knowledge production that is centering on this futurity and speculation, and in the fight against colonialism, racism, and patriarchy in Martinique, Guadeloupe. Do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah. What I would what I would say is so one of the responsibility I take in my not in my work, but as one of the few Martinican scholars in France, like, it's not responsible to me for me to only focus on the destruction, on the dehumanizing part. So that's why, of course, describing and understanding it is important because it allows you to fight better, as Gilmore would say. But that's also why I literally dedicate a bunch, an entire part into proposition. The very title of my book, which is not called the atrocities of the chlordécone, or the poisoning of the Martinican people, or the death, or like, it's not. The title of my book is called "Loving Ourselves Here." I didn't explain it today, and to me it was to change. Again, it's an intervention. I did not want my people to look at this case only with the lens of, oh, how much or how little I am contaminated, but really to change the question: how can I reconnect with the earth? In a sense, that is a sense that in essence, loving ourselves the earth, which in French explains itself better, Sémilité, is a way in which you can politically love ourselves or yourself only by engaging with the earth, and also recognizing that we are part of the earth. I mean, there's a wordplay that doesn't really work in English, and I wanted to highlight that, okay, we need to, especially because nowadays it will be technologically difficult to achieve a state where we get zero concentration of certain pesticides or molecule or plastics. So, and setting a new horizon, how can we love ourselves, or provide a new relationships? And of course, by love, I'm not referring to like, saying, okay, we love the earth because it's beautiful. I dedicate a chapter to this insect that I don't find particularly beautiful, but I think it's part of life, and calling attention to consider this being as part of our being, and in doing so, I find almost a kind of, I would not say joy, but enthusiasm in knowing that through this contamination, even though it's bad, I know that I am connected to all of these different species that I showed, and that the solution that will come is not just by saying, okay, I myself, I'm not contaminated anymore, but how I can politically consider the way we inhabit the earth with all of these species. So, and of course, I also work on the movement themselves, but I didn't present today. What has been the movement, and one of the movements is also there is a kind of, I think we call it lay knowledge or people or citizen science, but it's not exactly that, but it's people that are trying to produce knowledge and forms of knowledge about their own situation, and that is very important. And whether in that respect we want to use Afro speculative work is of course a beautiful proposition.
Thank you, Malcolm. We are a little bit over the time that we ask you, and I know that you have also some important business to attend. We have two other questions, but we can definitely also close here. So I want you to maybe check your phone if everything is okay. Do you feel that you can very briefly touch upon the last two questions? So maybe we can also stop here, and we will convey again for the next lecture. How is your time, Malcolm? Because we are now almost 5 minutes past.
So the last two question is
We have one question from Marco. It's here. I am opening here. There is only one. John Martinez Alier is asking. So we have an anti-colonial environmental movement, and do you have a working class environmental movement? No, he's asking. I think it's more a comment, maybe from Joan.
Yeah.
And then Marco, I can put together the two questions, so you decide what to do. Marco Pustinats is asking, I am interested in the means of engaging with the materiality of chemistry by radical environmental humanities. How important is this field invasion, and should it be done more often? So really the materiality of this chemistry that is really engaging now with the soil. So I don't know if you want to, even just in a minute, to say a few words about this last. I think they are both also comments in a sense, no?
Yeah. I would say there are comments, and so I'll try to have a general conclusion. One thing I would say is that this book is a dense, like I said, 14 years of research, not just research, of engagements, of engagement with scientists, with artists, with politicians, with workers, and with scholars. And I really try to enrich and complexify, but in a political way, the narratives. And of course, one of the core aspects of this contamination is the social aspect. The workers themselves, the agricultural workers, were the first contaminated, and yet they were the last one being invited to the discussion table. And definitely you have to cross the two. So you cannot say, okay, you have anti-colonial and then workers on the side. So you have workers within the anti-colonial and workers that are not anti-colonial, which is we open up a whole new page with especially the rise of the far right. I mean the arrival, because they are here in the world and France. So it's in terms of materiality, I'm not sure how to respond to that comment right away. If I were to summarize, I would say that in all of these different aspects, materiality, economy, politics, even speculative fiction, in the specific case of Martinique and Guadeloupe, which is not the same as Barbados, not the same as Jamaica, not the same as Haiti, there is a a purposeful, willful omission of the coloniality at play. Embedded in capitalism, embedded in environmental injustice. And so you may have environmental justice defendant that refuses to engage with the coloniality. That's why the ball fracture was important for me at the start. And what I'm calling is really to engage fully in this decolonial relation, not because it's fun, but because it allows for a better world, for a common world, a place where we can inhabit the world together on the condition of justice, equality, and yeah.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, everyone. I know that there are still questions in the chat, but we are almost 10 minutes over the time, and Malcolm needs to go. Well, let's remember to take control of the means of production of our own stories, and without forgetting also the other means of production, because while we are working on the means of production, why don't do both? Maybe.
Yeah.
And I also want to remember next meeting, February 11th, Nivedita Menon, Reshaping Words Beyond the Capitalist Horizon. Seems a good plan. And really, many, many thanks to Malcolm. I know that it was hard for you to find time today, and I'm so grateful, but we are so grateful to have you here. Your radical thinking is important for us.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Nuno. And thank all of the viewers, and hopefully meet you in some other places. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you. Bye, Marco. This was wonderful.
No. Bye. I am stopping here.